I'm going to turn at this point to Deb Weinstein with Starting Point. And one of the things I think that's helpful about having a statewide conversation is that every community is different, and our urban communities and our rural communities have different experiences and different challenges and different resources. And so one of the things that we'd love to hear from you about, Deb, is specifically shelter issues in such a rural community. How have those services changed, and what are you seeing as the greatest needs for shelter during this time?
Thank you, Lynn. Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see everybody. And I'm just amazed at how well we're doing Zoom now. I'm getting there. Shelter life as we know it and our shelter services have continued to go on for 24/7. However, they look really different than they looked 8 weeks ago. Um, we can't shut a shelter down. We need to maintain and make sure that our clients are safe. And just to kind of give you a little overview of what our shelter is like prior to COVID, so you could see sort of the change, because I think if you are not familiar with the shelter and how some of the things that normally occur in a shelter, you wouldn't understand why the changes are made or how this is really impacting people. So our shelter actually is staffed 24/7, either by a phone or staff. And all of our staff are involved with shelter, even although we have a full-time shelter manager and a part-time shelter advocate and child advocate for the shelter. Our staff is actually co-located in the shelter, so we're upstairs. So they have a lot of access to us, which makes it, I think, more effective for us to be able to provide services, because it's many of the neediest people who have the most challenges are really in our shelter. They're in imminent harm. They're in crisis. They come into crisis. It's a very tough time. They may have no food, no source of assistance, no job, no transportation, no access to their bank accounts. Abusers put credits in their name, and then they have bad credit. Lots of challenges ahead of them that need to be worked through. So it's a very, very intense program. So it's not just a room for you and your children, but it's actually an intense program. So one of the things that when we shifted in the pandemic is we were very concerned, of course, about our shelter clients and their children and keeping them safe. And so we went about increasing our cleaning services, disinfecting a couple times a week, teaching them about safe social distancing, the kids about social distancing, and we went remote. I had continued, as well as the shelter manager, in the shelter half days for about 3 or 4 weeks, and then I was advised that I should probably not be doing that. So I then transferred to home. However, I'm in the shelter at least 2 or 3 times a week, as is our shelter manager, because access to services is not where it used to be. I'll give you an example. We had a survivor who was very, very sick, not COVID, but very, very sick. She couldn't access her doctor, and they wanted to Zoom, but she didn't have a way to Zoom with them. So they were not open to seeing her unless she had COVID symptoms. So access to these types of services are really, really limited. And that produces a problem, especially counseling. If they're trying to do that Zoom, some of it's working, some of it's not, all kinds of different programs. Another thing is when somebody moves out of the shelter, then the room becomes available and we can take somebody in. So we've had the great fortune in this pandemic is that we were able to find someone permanent housing through our housing program. And she actually just moved out this week. We can't just take somebody in now because of COVID, because we're not only exposing the shelter guests and their children, but the person who is coming in and then the staff that are coming in. So it becomes really complicated. And also at this time, in terms of the needs, everything from food to money to transportation, because we're in a rural community, there's really not much public transportation, and we rely on taxis a lot when we're not available to transport. Our county is down to one taxi in the whole county. So county taxi services are basically none. So they can't get out. and also the challenges that face them in terms of what are they going to do for work in the future. We had 2 people lose their jobs. We don't know if they'll be called back. We have people who, are looking for a different job. Actually, someone's going on a job interview today, but they have to also look at the risks to them and their child, and we have to look at the risks to the shelter because they're going to be out in the community and they're going to be taking care of people. So it gets very, very complicated. Um, the good fortune we've had is we've had a fantastic group of people at the shelter who have really worked together to be strong through this. And it was interesting. One at the very beginning when this started, one of the shelter guests said to me, I'm really not panicked about this pandemic. And I said, okay. And she said, we've been through so much. I've been strangled. I've had a gun to my head. I've been beaten. My children have been threatened. I'm in a safe place. So to me, this doesn't seem as important to them. So it's been a really interesting reaction that we've received. Um, so after the pandemic hit, we, like everybody else, had a decrease in the number of calls. But in the last 2 weeks, we've had an increase in the number of lethal calls. So we have had 6 lethal cases that we have had to hide those people. And of course, they can't come into our shelter. So now we're talking about hotels in the state, out of the state. We were fortunate enough to find some safe homes that they could go to that's temporary, and also a temporary rental for 30 days. But all of this is probably going to be, we have to find housing for them. And as you know, in Carroll County, across the state, housing is terrible. If you look up how many available places there are in Carroll County, it always reports 0, which is, there's always 1 or 2 you can find, but the statistics are very low and the rent is very high. People are kicked out for the summer, so they have to actually live in a tent down by the water. It's very common for a whole population up here, not just victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, but our whole population to go tenting for the season so that landlords can make money. So then they're out there and they're vulnerable to violence, which also is just a terrible, terrible thing. So all that makes shelter life interesting, and it makes us look at how each day of how we can connect with our clients and victims and help meet them where they are, and the needs that they have. And those needs vary from, I need to get a prescription. I can't get a taxi. How am I going to get this prescription? So a staff member has to go out, get the prescription, deliver it back. All these different configurations that we have. Court has continued, as was mentioned, and we have a lot of pending court cases with a lot of people in shelter. So it's making it even more stressful. In terms of us, one of our greatest challenges is not just is the ability to not the ability to provide the services, but the ability to fund the services. As many of our sister agencies, our big fundraiser for the year has been canceled. And so we are over budget, and we are under our private fundraising goal, which is putting us in a quandary, which we really appreciate all the money that's come forth so far to help us out. And we've been using it to provide support for the population that we expect is going to increase. But we are looking towards next year's budget, and I have to say, I got a little frightened when I looked at next year's budget, because our whole life of fundraising has changed. Our whole life of community events, prevention has changed. We can't go out and do that necessarily. We have a lot of dinners at people's homes and bring in music and talk about domestic violence and sexual assault, and maybe raise a little bit of money, or people volunteer, or people just get educated. We don't know that that's even going to happen next year, because are people really going to open up their homes to us? Right now, they're not. So there's just that's just one little example of where we're at this point. We know next year we will not have our big fundraiser until actually the following fiscal year, which is September 2021, because we realized 200 people probably aren't going to want to get into a room together so quickly. And that there are a lot of complications about that. And then the other thing is business sponsorship. Businesses are hurting, they're closing, they don't have the money to help us. So it's making it challenging to meet the needs of the clients, especially in things like support services, food, clothing. A lot of the access to other services, they're closed. So we're having to create ways for them to get those services through us, and that's costing us more money. I don't know if any of that sort of rings a bell to people, but it's very, um, it, it's challenging and we love it because it makes us think and we can do a better job. And I think we're going to see our services change historically during this time, especially with texting and being able to connect on the computer. But I also think it's a scary time. It's a scary time for our advocates and more scary for our victims who can't report, can't get out. Children don't have mandatory reporters around them, so they're being victimized. We really expect an upsurgence when people start to come out of their homes and can contact us.
Thank you so much, Deb. I think your comments really illustrate how all of the services that you all are providing are so incredibly integrated and dependent on one another and what's happening in your community. So thank you.